Malcolm Avery walked onto the executive floor with an old leather briefcase and a temporary guest badge clipped to his blazer. Evelyn Carrington, the chief executive of Ardencrest Global, looked him over from shoes to collar, cut off his explanation mid-sentence, and coldly instructed security to remove the unauthorized man from the building. Malcolm did not argue. He set a sealed envelope on the reception counter and turned toward the elevator. Less than 1 minute later, the elevator doors opened again, and Chairman Walter Ashford came running across the lobby, abandoning his directors, calling Malcolm's name like the entire company was about to collapse behind him. If you love a reversal that makes an arrogant executive pay for every insult, hit subscribe and stay with this story until the very last minute. I know things I have no right to know. I know what Malcolm Avery was thinking at 6:40 that Friday morning, in a kitchen that smelled like burnt toast, listening to a coffee maker that had been failing the same cycle for 2 years. I know he considered the newer blazer hanging in his closet and decided against it, because he had never once believed that a garment could argue on his behalf. I know that his phone buzzed on the counter with a message from his daughter, Lauren, who was 15 and asleep upstairs and had scheduled the message the night before so it would arrive at exactly the right hour. It said good luck, and it said do not let them talk over you, and it ended with a small drawing made out of punctuation that he did not fully understand but liked anyway. He typed back 3 words, put the phone in his pocket, and picked up a scuffed leather briefcase that had been repaired twice. He took the train downtown and walked 6 blocks into a wind coming off the water. At the desk in the pale stone lobby of Ardencrest Global, a woman typed his name, frowned, typed it again, and printed a gray badge. Gray was the color that building used for vendors. Nobody had explained that to him, and nobody needed to. She was 47, the daughter of a family that had been moving money quietly for 4 generations, and she had turned Ardencrest's operating margin from thin to admirable in under 2 years by doing what is usually done, which is removing things. She believed, with the total sincerity of a person who has never stood on the other side of it, that value announces itself immediately. Title, tailoring, the confidence of a man who knows a car is waiting for him. The belief had never failed her because the world she moved through had been arranged to confirm it. That morning she stepped out of her office, took the corridor at her usual pace, and saw a man in a worn blazer stepping off the elevator with a gray badge and an old briefcase. Malcolm saw her coming and did the thing he always does, which is to stop moving and let the other person arrive. He said good morning, gave his name clearly, and said he had a meeting with Chairman Ashford at 9:30. His voice carried no particular deference, and I think that was the first small thing that irritated her, because deference was the sound she expected from a gray badge. She did not ask him to repeat the name. She did not ask which company he represented. She said that Mr. Ashford did not hold spontaneous meetings on the morning of a board session, and she said it in the tone of a woman correcting a factual error rather than a woman receiving new information. Malcolm tried once more. He said he understood how it looked, that he was aware the day was full, and that the chairman himself had reached out to him 9 days earlier. He offered to wait anywhere she preferred until someone could confirm it. Evelyn took a half-step back, folded her arms across a coat that cost more than the annual salary of the woman at the reception desk, and told him that if he were as important as he was implying, his name would already be on her calendar. That sentence is worth sitting with. It was not a lie. It was a complete philosophy in 14 words. Importance is a thing that appears on my schedule, and if it has not appeared there, it does not exist. Malcolm took out his phone. He opened the message thread and turned the screen toward her, and I can tell you what was on it. A message sent 9 days earlier from Walter Ashford's personal address, using Malcolm's first name, asking whether he could make Friday morning and closing with a line that said, "This cannot wait another quarter." It was 2 inches from her face. All she had to do was let her eyes fall 4 degrees. She did not look. She said that she was not going to review correspondence held up by a man she had never met, and that if he had a legitimate procurement matter, he could file it through the appropriate channel like everyone else. Malcolm put the phone back in his pocket without any visible reaction, which I want to note is not the same as being unbothered. He is a man who has been assessed on site in 1,000 lobbies since he was 19 years old, and he long ago made a strategic decision about where to spend his anger. He said quietly that he thought she should call Mr. Ashford before deciding anything further. He meant it as a kindness. He meant, "I am giving you a door, walk through it, and none of this happened." But there is no sentence in the English language more infuriating to a person like Evelyn Carrington than a piece of correct advice delivered by someone she has already classified as beneath advising. Her face changed. It did not get louder. It got smoother, which is the more dangerous direction. She said that she did not need a guest wearing a temporary badge to instruct her on how to run operations inside her own building. She said the word guest the way you would hold a wet napkin. Somebody behind her turned a laugh into a cough. Grant Holloway, standing near the window with his unanswered memo, looked up sharply because he had spent 18 months watching this woman treat correction as insubordination. Then Evelyn turned toward Dale, the head of building security, who had worked in that lobby for 11 years and had never once enjoyed a moment like this one. She said 4 words, "Escort him downstairs, please." Malcolm did not move. He looked at her for what felt to everyone present like a long time, and was probably 3 seconds. Then he asked, in the same even register he had used for everything else that morning, whether she was certain. Not a threat, not a plea. A last, clean offer of an exit ramp extended by a man who understood precisely what was about to become irreversible and would rather it did not. And Evelyn Carrington, who had built her entire career on the proposition that hesitation reads as weakness, gave him the answer that would cost her everything she had. She said, completely. So it happened. 2 security officers came up the corridor, and they were polite about it, which somehow made it worse. One of them said, "Sir." One of them gestured toward the elevator bank with an open hand, the way a maitre d' shows you to a table. Malcolm walked between them, unhurried, carrying his own briefcase, past operations directors who had stopped pretending not to watch, past the conference room where 2 members of the board had just arrived, and stepped into the doorway to see what the noise was. Richard Pembroke, 9 years a director, watched a black man in an old blazer being walked to an elevator by uniformed men, felt a flicker of discomfort, and talked himself out of it within 4 seconds, because Evelyn was standing there looking composed, and composure is contagious. At the elevator, he stopped. The doors were open. He had the envelope in his left hand, and he was entirely free to take it with him, and I promise you that a very large part of him wanted to. There would have been a kind of justice in that, the clean and total withdrawal, the walking away with the answer still sealed in your pocket while the building goes on believing it does not need you. He stood there for 4 full seconds with that option available to him. Then he did something that I think explains him better than any credential ever could, and better than anything he says out loud in the rest of this story. He turned and walked back to the reception counter. The 2 security officers, unsure of protocol, followed at a distance and did not stop him. He set the sealed white envelope down on the polished surface, squared it gently with 2 fingers, and said to the receptionist that if Mr. Ashford asked, she should give him this. His tone was ordinary, the tone of a man leaving a package for a neighbor. Then he stepped back toward the elevator. Evelyn, who could not let a final word belong to anyone else, asked what it was. Malcolm paused with one hand on the elevator frame. He looked at her without any heat at all, without triumph, without the faintest performance of a man who knows something, and he said, "It is the thing you just decided you did not need." The doors closed on him, and for perhaps 8 seconds the corridor was completely silent, because a sentence like that leaves a residue, and everyone standing there could feel it drying on the walls. Evelyn recovered first, because recovery was her core competency. She turned to Grant Holloway with a small dismissive shake of the head and said that small suppliers pull this exact maneuver when an agreement is coming up for renewal, that it is a pressure tactic, that they show up on a board day and hover near leadership, hoping somebody will get nervous and sign something. She said she had seen it 3 times at her previous firm. Grant did not answer. He was standing very still, and a question had opened in his mind like a trapdoor. Which agreement? He had personally reviewed every material contract with a renewal date inside the next 2 quarters, and he could not place a single supplier that matched what he had just watched. He started to ask. Evelyn was already walking toward the boardroom. At 9:42, the elevator at the far end of the corridor opened, and Walter Ashford stepped out. He was 68, silver-haired, and had been chairman for 11 years and a director for 19 before that, and in all that time no employee had ever seen him raise his voice, hurry, or fail to remember a name. He was already looking down the corridor for someone. He reached the reception counter, glanced at the empty chairs by the window, and asked the question that split the morning in half. Where is Malcolm Avery? The boardroom door opened and Evelyn appeared in it, because she had heard the chairman's voice, and it was in her nature to meet an arrival at the threshold rather than wait to be entered upon. She looked composed. She said, pleasantly, that if he was referring to the vendor who had been loitering on the floor, she had already handled it and asked security to see him out of the building. She said it the way you report a resolved item. She may even have expected a small nod of approval for having protected the chairman's morning. Walter Ashford did not nod. He said 2 words, and everyone who was standing in that corridor has told the story the same way since, which is that they had never heard his voice do that before. He said, "You what?" Not loud. Flat and slightly hollow, the sound a man makes when the floor he has been standing on turns out to be a tarp over a hole. The color left his face in a visible way. Richard Pembroke, watching from the boardroom doorway, felt that flicker of discomfort return, and this time it did not go away, because whatever was happening was clearly not a procedural matter, and Walter Ashford did not lose his composure over procedural matters. Evelyn started to explain. She got as far as saying that the man had no appointment on record and had been attempting to reach the executive level with a temporary badge. Walter had already stopped listening to her, which was an experience she had not had in 18 months and did not have vocabulary for. His eyes had gone past her shoulder to the reception counter, where a white envelope was lying squared against the edge of the marble. He crossed to it in 4 steps and picked it up and read the line printed across the front, and his hand, which had signed authorizations worth more than the annual budget of a mid-sized city, was not quite steady. The elevator was on 18. He watched the number for 1 second and then went for the stairwell door instead, shoving it open with his shoulder, and the fire door banged against the wall with a sound like a dropped tray. 2 board members went after him because it did not occur to them to do anything else. Grant Holloway followed. Serena Whitmore, who had emerged from a side office holding a stack of disclosure schedules, looked once at Evelyn's face and then went too, and she was the only person in that stairwell who had already begun to guess. Outside, the wind off the water had picked up. Malcolm was most of the way to the parking structure on the corner, where he had not parked a car, because he was walking toward the train and the structure was simply on the route. He had his collar up and his briefcase in his right hand, and he was, at that moment, composing in his head the message he would send Lauren later, trying to find a version of the morning that would not teach her anything he did not want her to learn yet. He heard the doors behind him and he did not turn, because city doors are always making noise. Then he heard his name, Malcolm, Loud, ragged, out of breath, carrying down half a block of sidewalk. He turned. Walter Ashford came the last 30 feet at a heavy jog and stopped in front of him and put both hands on his knees for a second, and when he straightened up, his tie was over his shoulder and his face was gray with effort. Behind him, at a distance, 4 board members and a chief financial officer and a lawyer were coming through the revolving doors in an undignified cluster. Walter got his breath. And the first thing he said to Malcolm Avery, on a public sidewalk in front of a dozen employees and 2 directors and a woman who had just arrived at the door and heard every syllable of it, was, "Please, please do not leave." Evelyn Carrington heard that. She was standing just outside the entrance with the wind pulling at her coat, and she heard the chairman of her board say "please" to the man she had removed from the building 11 minutes earlier. I have wondered often what she felt in that instant. I do not think it was guilt. I think it was something much smaller and much more physical, the sensation of a floor tilting, of a fact you have already spent arriving somewhere in the mail. Walter turned and looked at her. And he said, loudly enough that nobody had to lean in, "Do you have any idea what the man you just threw out of this building owns?" He started 7 years back. Arden Crest had come within 11 days of losing its largest industrial client, when a cascading failure in freight routing left $400 million of committed volume with no viable path to the eastern seaboard. 2 port strikes, a bankrupt regional carrier, and a software vendor whose system could not model any of it. 3 of the largest consulting firms in the world came back with plans that would take 9 to 14 months. What they had was 11 days. He did not forget. Over the following 3 years, he took what he had built in that windowless room and developed it into a full system. He named it the Atlas Protocol. It is not glamorous technology. What it does is model failure. It maintains live secondary and tertiary routing for every major lane the company runs. It prices port and weather and labor risk continuously. It triggers pre-negotiated capacity with backup carriers before a disruption is visible to anyone reading the news. And it produces the auditable continuity documentation that federal contracts require a vendor to demonstrate before they will sign. Walter said that last part twice, slowly, because he wanted the board to hear it. The continuity standard in the agreement they were about to approve was satisfied, in its entirety, by Atlas. Evelyn spoke for the first time in several minutes. She said that Atlas was a core internal system. She said it with confidence, because that is what it was called in every operating review she had ever sat through, in the standard corporate shorthand where anything running inside the building is described as ours. Walter looked down the table at Serena Whitmore. And Serena, who had spent the elevator ride pulling a schedule of licensed technologies onto her tablet and had already found what she was looking for, said no. Atlas Protocol was not owned by Arden Crest Global. It never had been. It was owned, wholly and without encumbrance, by Avery Resilience Group, a consultancy of 19 employees operating out of leased offices above a dry cleaner in a neighborhood where none of the people at that table had ever eaten lunch. Arden Crest held a license. The license was for a fixed term. It had been renewed twice, both times through a procurement office that treated it as a routine software line item, and both times signed by a director who had no idea what it was. Serena read the termination date out loud. It expired that day at 12 o'clock noon. The clock on the wall said 10:14. She said evenly that this was straightforward. They would extend. She turned to Malcolm and asked what the number was. And there was something in the way she asked it that told everyone at the table exactly what she believed had been happening all morning. That a small operator had engineered a maximum leverage moment and was about to name a price, and that she was the adult who would pay it and move on. She was almost relieved. A shakedown was a situation she knew how to handle. Malcolm looked at her for a moment. Then he said, without any edge at all, that he had not come there to ask for more money. Walter set the envelope on the table without opening it and told the room the rest of it. He had contacted Malcolm 9 days earlier, personally, chairman to founder, after a conversation that had cost him a week of sleep. He had asked Malcolm to come in on Friday morning before the board voted and to bring what he had. Malcolm had not requested the meeting. Malcolm had not been trying to reach anyone in that building. The board of Arden Crest Global had needed him to come, and he had rearranged a client engagement in Cleveland to do it. And he had been walked out of the lobby by 2 security officers 11 minutes before he was scheduled to speak. Then Malcolm looked at the envelope in Walter's hands and said that the expiring license was not the problem. Walter said, "I know," and Malcolm looked directly at Evelyn Carrington, without cruelty and without softness, and said, "The problem is why the system is no longer capable of protecting this company." He agreed to present, and he set one condition out loud so that it could not be quietly adjusted later. Nobody was going to take him into a side office and apologize privately in order to make the morning disappear. If the board wanted what he had, they would hear all of it, in the room, with the chief executive present, and they would hear it whether or not it was comfortable. Walter agreed before anyone else could speak. And that is how Evelyn Carrington came to spend the next 50 minutes sitting in a chair, listening to a man she had ordered removed from the premises, with no available exit that would not look exactly like what it was. Malcolm opened the old laptop and put up a plain network diagram, gray lines on white, and began at the beginning, the way a person does when he is not trying to impress anybody. Atlas, he explained, is not software that runs on its own. It is a system that assumes a physical structure underneath it. It assumes redundancy. It assumes that when it calls for a secondary route, the secondary route exists, has been tested inside the last 90 days, and has staffed capacity waiting at the other end. It assumes manual verification, because automated port data is wrong roughly 4% of the time, and a bad input at the wrong hour becomes a routing decision that cannot be reversed once freight is moving. Take the structure away, he said, and you do not get a weaker system. You get a system that reports full confidence while standing on nothing. Then he put up what had been removed. In 18 months under Evelyn Carrington's cost program, Arden Crest had closed 3 regional contingency hubs, in Norfolk, in Stockton, and outside Kansas City. It had eliminated the manual verification team, 11 people, replaced by an automated feed with no secondary confirmation. It had cut preventive maintenance headcount across the Western network by 31%. It had let lapse the standby capacity agreements with 4 backup carriers, on the reasonable sounding grounds that nobody had called on them in 2 years. Each decision alone was defensible, and each had a memorandum behind it with a number in the savings column. Together they had removed nearly every layer that Atlas was built to reach for, and the total annual saving was $14 million against a partnership the board was preparing to approve at a value of $2.3 billion. Evelyn pushed back, and she pushed back with the strongest argument available to her, which is the argument every executive uses when a warning arrives without a corpse attached. She said the system was working. She said the network had run for 18 months without a single service failure, that on-time performance was at a 5-year high, and that she was not prepared to be lectured about a catastrophe that had conspicuously failed to occur. Several directors nodded, because it is a genuinely good point, and because nothing on earth is harder to sell than the value of a thing that prevents events. Malcolm let the nodding finish before he answered. He said, "Yes, it has worked every day. It will keep working every day." And then he said the sentence that Grant Holloway later admitted he wrote down word for word on the inside cover of his binder. It works right up until the day it has to do the thing it was built to do. A fire suppression system, he said, has a flawless record until there is a fire. What you have measured for 18 months is the absence of an emergency. and you have concluded from it the presence of a capability, and those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the entire reason my company exists." And then Grant Holloway spoke, and he spoke like a man setting down something he had been carrying for a very long time. He said he had written a memorandum 11 months earlier titled Operational Risk Concentration Following Network Consolidation. He said he had sent it to the chief executive and requested a working session. He said the response he received had been a single line asking him to bring a revised savings schedule instead. He opened his binder, took out a photocopy, and slid it down the table toward Richard Pembroke. Nobody at that table had ever seen it. It had been written for them, and it had never traveled 10 feet from the desk it landed on. Evelyn changed targets. It was the wrong move, and I think part of her knew it even as she made it. But she had been in the room's crosshairs for 20 minutes and instinct took over. She said, to the board rather than to Malcolm, that she wanted the directors to be clear about who they were listening to. A boutique consultancy with fewer than 24 employees, no audited operational history at scale, and an obvious commercial interest in convincing a client that it could not function without him. She said it well. It was, in fairness, the argument any competent chief executive would have reached for. Malcolm did not get angry. I have watched footage of a great many men in that exact position, and almost all of them get angry, and the anger is always what the room remembers instead of the argument. He waited 2 seconds. Then he asked one question, in a completely ordinary voice. "Does the size of my company make any of these numbers wrong?" Nobody answered. Evelyn opened her mouth and closed it. She could not say yes because she had no analysis in front of her, and she could not say no because no was a surrender, so she said nothing, and silence in a boardroom is a verdict. Serena Whitmore looked at Walter. Walter looked at the table. Then Malcolm delivered the part he had actually come for, and it was worse than anything that had preceded it. He said that everything he had shown them so far described the network as it currently ran. The agreement in front of the board that morning would increase committed volume on the Eastern and Gulf lanes by 94% within 14 months. He put the model up. With the hubs closed and the standby agreements lapsed, Atlas could hold single-point disruptions and would fail on any concurrent event across 2 lanes, and such events had occurred in the American freight network 4 times in 6 years. He was not there to renegotiate a license. He was there to keep them from putting their signature on a service guarantee to the federal government that their own physical network could not honor. The room absorbed that, and in the middle of it, Serena Whitmore, who had been paging through the transaction disclosure package on her tablet with increasing speed, said Walter's name in a tone that made everyone turn. She had found a line in Section 4 of the Technology and Capabilities Annex. It described the Atlas Protocol as proprietary technology owned by Arden Crest Global. She read it twice. It had been drafted by outside counsel from a summary provided by the executive office. It had been reviewed by nobody who knew better, and it was scheduled to be filed with a federal counterparty that afternoon. Malcolm said, very quietly, that he had never authorized that. And Serena, in the flat voice lawyers use when they have stopped worrying about anyone's feelings, said that if that document were filed as written, the company would be making a material misrepresentation of ownership to a government client, and that the exposure from that single paragraph would exceed anything else discussed in the room by an order of magnitude. There was a pause, and then Evelyn Carrington made her final and most consequential decision of the day, which was to fight. She told the board that they were being managed. She laid it out cleanly. This man's license expires at noon today, on the exact morning of the vote, and that timing is not a coincidence. He has known about it for years. He waited. He let it come to the wire. He arrives on the single day of the year when this company has the least possible ability to say no, carrying documents designed to frighten a board of directors. and he presents himself as a concerned citizen who wants nothing. Nobody wants nothing, she said. He is holding intellectual property against a $2.3 billion transaction, and whatever number he eventually names will be a number we cannot refuse. She turned to Malcolm and said, "So name it, and let us stop performing." Richard Pembroke shifted in his seat, and I want to be honest about Richard, because he is the most ordinary person in this story, and therefore the most useful. He was a 71-year-old director with 11 other commitments who had come in expecting to approve a transaction, and he had just been handed a version of events that restored the world to its familiar shape. He said, carefully, that the point about timing deserved an answer. Malcolm agreed with him. He said the timing question was fair, and that he would answer it in one move rather than with a speech. Then he asked Walter Ashford to open the envelope. Walter picked it up. The room was completely silent. I am told you could hear the ventilation. He worked a finger under the flap, tore it, and pulled out 3 pages held together with a single staple. He read the first one. Then he read it again, and he set it down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something you are afraid of dropping. And he pushed it toward the center so that the directors nearest him could see. It was a license extension. Atlas Protocol, granted to Ardencrest Global for a term of 18 additional months at the existing fee schedule with no increase of any kind. It had been prepared 8 days earlier. It was signed at the bottom in blue ink by Malcolm Avery, founder, Avery Resilience Group. All it had ever needed was a countersignature. What that did to the room was not a gasp. It was a slow, spreading quiet, the kind that arrives when 11 experienced people recalculate a man at the same instant. He had walked in at 9:30 carrying, in a sealed envelope, the total surrender of every ounce of leverage he possessed. On the day of the vote, with the clock running out at noon, with $2.3 billion hanging on a technology only he owned. Any consultant on the Eastern Seaboard would have called that the best negotiating position of a lifetime. And he had brought the extension pre-signed and given it away before anyone in the building had even agreed to listen to him. Malcolm said he did want 4 things, and that none of them were money. An independent audit of the continuity architecture, by a firm chosen by the board rather than by management, delivered unedited. Restoration of the contingency hubs, the manual verification function, and the standby carrier agreements. Correction of every document that misstated the ownership of Atlas, and deferral of the transaction until the network's real capacity under the new volume had been verified. He said he would extend the license for 18 months, regardless of whether they agreed to any of it, because he was not willing to hold a system hostage that 4,000 employees depended on to do their jobs safely. Grant Holloway turned and looked at Evelyn and said the sentence that ended her, and there was nothing theatrical about it at all. He said, "He came here to give us more time." Evelyn tried once more, and this last attempt was almost admirable in its refusal to die. She told the board that Ardencrest possessed the engineering resources to build a replacement continuity platform internally within 90 days, and that the company should not be structurally dependent on a 19-person vendor regardless of the merits. She said they could take the 18 months and use them to become independent. Malcolm did not object. He said evenly that 90 days was optimistic but not impossible, and that if they built it properly he would be glad, because that would mean the network was safer. It was Serena Whitmore who closed the door in the least dramatic voice in the room. Building the platform was not the constraint. The federal certification process required the demonstrating system to have been in continuous documented operation with audited incident history for at least 24 months. A new platform would start that clock on the day it went live. If Atlas were withdrawn before the replacement completed certification, the guarantee underlying the entire partnership would have no qualifying system behind it. and the agreement could not proceed on anything resembling the schedule the board had been shown that morning. Evelyn sat down. She did not concede anything out loud. She simply stopped speaking, and everyone understood. Walter Ashford took the room back then, and he had one more question, and it was the question that opened the last door. He asked Malcolm why. Not why he was there that morning, he knew that. He asked why Malcolm had begun auditing a client system on his own time 6 months earlier, unpaid, without being asked, running models on a network he had no contractual obligation to monitor. Malcolm said, "Because somebody inside this company contacted me." It was a mid-level continuity engineer, 8 years at Arden Crest, who had watched the Norfolk hub close, and then watched a priority 1 alert get reclassified for the 11th time in 1 quarter. That engineer had gone home, found the copyright notice at the bottom of a system screen, and sent a message to a general inquiry address on a Sunday night, saying that he did not know whether this was appropriate but believed the man who built the system should know what was being taken out from under it. And here is what made the account credible instead of paranoid. Malcolm said, before anyone could accuse him of overreaching, that he had found no evidence Evelyn Carrington had personally edited a single one of those reports, and that he did not believe she had. "That is not how it works," he said. What she had done was simpler. She had made clear in every operating review and every response to every memorandum that a problem brought to her was a reflection on the person carrying it. He quoted a line she had used in 3 separate quarterly sessions, a line that several people in the room recognized instantly because they had heard her say it and had privately repeated it afterward with a certain grim humor. "Do not bring me problems. Bring me outcomes." "That," Malcolm said, "is a policy. You do not have to falsify anything. You simply have to make honesty expensive, and then wait, and the reports will edit themselves." Every manager under her had learned within 2 quarters that the fastest route to a difficult year was to carry bad news into her office. So they stopped. They softened. They downgraded. Not one of them did anything they would have described as dishonest. And collectively they built a reporting system that transmitted only good news to a board of directors that was preparing to double the company's obligations. Walter turned to Evelyn and asked, directly, why the board had never seen any of it, and she made the last error of her tenure, which was to blame the people beneath her. She said that operational escalation was the responsibility of the operations leadership, that she had relied on the reports she was given, and that if material risks had been filtered before reaching her office, then that was a failure at the review layer and she would address it. It was, technically, an accurate description of a mechanism. It was also a chief executive telling 11 directors that 4,000 employees had failed her. But it was Serena Whitmore who produced the piece that ended the morning, and she had not gone looking for it. She had been searching the executive office correspondence for any prior disclosure regarding Atlas ownership, and she found something else. A message sent 3 days before that Friday, from Walter Ashford to the chief executive's senior assistant, with a copy to the chief executive. Serena read it aloud. "Please ensure Malcolm Avery receives unrestricted access to Friday's board session." Nobody moved. Serena confirmed the delivery record. The message had been opened in Evelyn Carrington's mailbox at 7:51 on Wednesday morning, 43 hours before Malcolm walked into the lobby. It contained his full name, twice. Walter Ashford asked her the question, and he asked it slowly. He said, "You had his name in writing on Wednesday. He was standing in your corridor on Friday. He introduced himself to you by name before you said a word to him, and you had security remove him from this building without ever once asking who he was." Evelyn said that she received 400 messages a day. It was true. It was also, as an answer, nothing at all, and every person at that table heard it land and die. Walter said, "You removed a man from this building, and you did not know his name." She did not answer that. There was no answer to it. The truth, which she would not say out loud in that room, and which I suspect she has still not said out loud anywhere, was that she had not needed his name, because she had never intended to find out what he was. She had decided what he was in 2 seconds in a corridor, using a badge color and a briefcase, and everything after that had been administration. Malcolm spoke then, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not point at her, and he did not use the word that everybody in that room was carefully walking around. He said, "That is the problem. You decided I was not worth listening to before you knew who I was. If I had been what you thought I was, a supplier's account manager with a bad blazer, the decision would have been just as wrong, and this company would still be signing that agreement this afternoon. The only difference today is that you happened to guess wrong about the man." She found Malcolm in the corridor 20 minutes later. He was standing by the window at the far end, where the light came in over the harbor, drinking bad machine coffee out of a paper cup and answering a message from Lauren, who had asked how it was going and to whom he had written the word fine. Evelyn stopped a few feet away. She had spent 20 minutes alone with the situation, and she had arrived at a theory which was the only shape her mind had ever been able to hold other people in. She said, "You think they are going to hand you this company after all of this?" And Malcolm almost laughed, not cruelly. It was a real, tired, surprised sound, the laugh of a man being accused of wanting something that has genuinely never crossed his mind. He said, "I have never wanted your company." Then he told her the only thing he said to her all day that could be called personal, and even that he said mildly. He said, "I was not trying to embarrass you in that corridor. I gave you 3 chances to make 1 phone call. I would have taken any of them." The boardroom doors opened at 11:51. Walter Ashford read the resolutions out in a level voice with the whole room seated, including Evelyn, who was given a chair at the side rather than the head of the table, and who took it without expression. The transaction was deferred pending independent verification of operational capacity. An independent audit was commissioned immediately, reporting to the board. The license extension executed by Malcolm Avery was countersigned by the chairman at 11:56, 4 minutes before it lapsed. The ownership language in Section 4 was struck and corrected before filing, and the restoration of the contingency hubs, the manual verification function, and the standby carrier agreements was ordered to begin within 30 days, with progress reported to the board monthly. Then Walter read the last one. By resolution of the Board of Directors, Evelyn Carrington was suspended from the office of Chief Executive, with immediate effect, pending a governance review of executive risk reporting and operational decision-making during the preceding 18 months. There were no handcuffs, no police officers, no shouting, nothing anybody could have made into a spectacle. There was simply a woman who had walked into that building at 7:15 in the morning, holding complete authority over 4,000 people, standing up at noon and walking out of the room she had governed, carrying her own folder, with nobody following her. That is what it actually looks like when power leaves. It is very quiet, and it takes about 9 seconds. She walked toward the elevator bank, past the counter where the envelope had been, past the spot where she had told a man his name would be on her calendar if it mattered. The same 2 security officers were standing there, and one of them looked at Walter Ashford with a question on his face, because the morning had established a precedent. Malcolm saw it, and he said to the officers in a completely ordinary voice, "There is no need to escort her. She knows the way out." It was not a victory lap. He said it the way you would decline a second cup of coffee. But it went through that corridor like a current, because everyone standing in it had been standing in it 3 hours earlier, and they understood exactly what had been returned and to whom. Evelyn Carrington stopped for half a second. She did not turn around. Then she stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed on her, and that was the last time she was ever inside that building. Walter found Malcolm by the window afterward and offered him a title. Chief Resilience Officer, reporting to the Chief Executive, a seat on the operating committee, a compensation package that Walter began to describe, and Malcolm interrupted before the first number arrived. Malcolm said no. He said he would take an engagement as an independent advisor, with a defined scope, a fixed term, and the right to report directly to the board without passing through management. Walter asked him why, and pointed out, reasonably, that the title came with a great deal more authority. Malcolm said, "I spent 11 years building my own company. I do not need a large office to know that my work has value." And then he added the part that Walter repeated at 3 separate industry dinners over the following year. "If I take a title here, then in 2 years I will be another executive who is afraid to bring the board bad news. Keep me outside. Outside is where I am useful to you." 4 months later, the audit came back worse than Malcolm's model in 2 areas, and better in 1. Norfolk and Stockton reopened. Kansas City was replaced with a leased facility on better terms. The verification team was rebuilt to 9 people, 7 of them rehired by name. Standby agreements were restored with 3 of the 4 original carriers. Every document that misstated ownership of Atlas was corrected. And the partnership was renegotiated on a phased schedule, with volume increasing over 31 months instead of 14, at a slightly lower headline value that the federal counterparty accepted without argument because the delivery plan was, for the first time, actually true. Malcolm did not become chief executive of anything. Avery Resilience Group stayed 19 people above a dry cleaner, then 24 the following spring, and he still did his own printing. But something had changed in the lobby of that tower, and it was not a policy. When he came through those doors now, nobody looked at the blazer. Nobody looked at the badge, which was still gray, because he had never asked for a different one and thought the whole system was slightly funny. Nobody asked him if he was sure he was on the right floor. The woman at the reception desk knew his name before he said it, and so did the 2 security officers, one of whom made a point of saying good morning to him every single time, and never once mentioned why. That Friday evening he took the train home and got in at 6:40, and found Lauren doing homework at the kitchen table with the burnt toast smell still faintly in the air. She asked how the meeting went, and he said, putting the old briefcase down by the door. They listened. That was the entire report. He did not tell her that a chief executive had lost her office that day, or that the chairman of a 94-year-old corporation had run down 40 flights of stairs and across a marble lobby and out onto a public sidewalk to ask him please not to leave. He has still never told her. He decided somewhere around the second stop on the train that a 15-year-old does not need to learn that the world hands out apologies only after it discovers you own something. Lauren looked at the briefcase, with its resewn seam and its corner worn down to the pale underleather, and asked whether he was ever actually going to buy a new one. Malcolm smiled and said that this one still did the job. She rolled her eyes and went back to her homework, and he started dinner, and that was the whole evening. The next morning, Walter Ashford opened a message on his phone containing a photograph that somebody in the building had taken from the mezzanine without asking anyone's permission. It showed the lobby at 9 o'clock, the pale stone, the silent screens, the coffee bar, and a man in an old blazer walking across the floor toward the elevators with a briefcase in his right hand. No security detail, no entourage, no one clearing a path in front of him. He was not walking any differently than he had walked across that same floor on the morning he was removed from it. Only one thing about the picture had changed, and it was not in the frame. It was in every person standing at the edges of it, and it will be there for the rest of their working lives. Every one of them had looked straight through that man once, and every one of them now knew that the chairman of the board had run through his own building, past his directors, down 40 flights of stairs and out into the street, for no other reason than to stop that man from walking away.